Hello everyone, my name is Sonia Firsova and currently I am a contractor VFX artist on Project L at Riot and mentor and instructor at VFX Apprentice. I've been in game dev industry since 2015 as an artist, character animator and VFX artist, and I see a lot of intersections between all these fields. And in this video I want to share with you my observations on how artistic principles of composition correlate with visual effects. Let's get into it. We will start with these two examples. They both use composition in a very efficient way. With all the complexity of details and movements, you are still able to focus on one scene at a time, and gradually explore the additional details while following supportive guides that the shapes create. In this illustration by Nico Delort, probably the first thing that caught your attention was the figure at the bottom right corner. It grabs the attention with the long straight lines that go throughout all the frame, and it has a great contrast in values and shape language around this area. Then we start exploring the details around this focal point and catch one of the guides the illustration has to point you to the next subject, the face of Athena, and then back to the figure at the bottom right. These guides create a full loop around the canvas to keep the viewer's attention inside the frame and allow to see all the details in some kind of an order without feeling lost. So everything works together, and in the illustration it is a matter of one frame. But in VFX we need this to work with the whole sequence. We think about composition on the whole frames, but we can also apply it to the motion in general. In this explosion animation, made by VFX Apprentice instructor Dan Elder, every bit of animation has a clear focal point. Shape language and flow of movement lead the viewer to what they should be looking at. This example also has smooth transitions between these focal points, by using anticipations and subtle movements that lead you to be prepared for what happens next. So again, everything works together. Now let's break down into smaller instances how we can create a clear composition. Starting with balance and clear motion. These two are all about making the composition work in a bigger picture. Using balance helps to digest the frame and lead attention by using big volumes of shapes in mind. It is all about how you distribute your volumes of shapes and how they affect the perception of the piece. On these two illustrations for The Amazing Spider-Man Volume 1, we see pretty much the same story. It is a Spider-Man doing cool mid-air moves. But these two illustrations feel quite differently. The one on the left feels more static for the viewer. We focus strongly on the Spider-Man's face, and it's moving right on us, like we will engage with this figure just in a second. The one on the right catches a more dynamic feeling for us. We feel the tension to follow the movement to the right side. And not like one is better than another, they both work great for their purpose. It is the initial goal that is different for these two illustrations. The one on the left uses a symmetrically balanced composition. It has a very strong force to pull the attention to the center of the frame. Note that it doesn't mean that both halves are perfectly mirrored. It's more about distributing the weight of different values to create a balance around the center. The one on the right uses a symmetrical balance. It creates a strong feeling of movement even on static image. The smaller details placed on the further distance work as a lever to create dynamic tension between the shapes. Let's see how it works in effects. The explosion we looked at before has a strong symmetrical composition. It creates this heavy, right-in-your-face feeling, which works perfectly for this effect. And notice again, the shapes are not placed perfectly symmetrical in any point. They have a variety of sizes and placements which are balanced around the central point. So we still have some tension to make the animation feel exciting. And now if we look at this effect created by Jason Kaiser, we see an asymmetrical composition. The idea for this effect is showing big movements around the frame. And we see how during these movements, big shapes are being balanced with smaller shapes on the further end. These small shapes not only help the viewer to show where the fireball came from, but they also create a tension dynamic balance on the frame. And this tension between big and small shapes are also applicable for a more static on the frame movement too. In this wispy explosion made by our instructor David Shavlin, we see shapes of different sizes and quantity. There are a few really big shapes, a bunch of medium-sized shapes, and quite a lot of the smallest ones. So the smaller detail is, the bigger quantity of them there are. And this brings this tension and variety in the effect. We are able to bring in more details in certain places while still having a very clear view of what is happening. You can also see that during the effect, the actual sizes of these big, medium, small instances change, but the correlation between them stays the same. I personally see a lot of fun in searching and finding these kind of correlations between the shapes. As I've mentioned earlier, a symmetrical composition gives us a strong feeling of movement. Differently placed shapes and their volumes create line of action. So we can start with it, taking the idea of the dynamic balance to the very start of the workflow. Then I add volumes of shapes along the section line, thinking about how I can balance them around it to push the idea of the movement. In this example, I wanted to have a feeling of movement to the right side, so I placed a bigger volume on the right side too and balanced it with the medium volume on the left. And then added smaller details to bring additional variety and more tension between all these shapes. And all these shapes are also curved and pointed to support the action line. Starting with line of action is a simple but quite powerful idea for catching the main action of the effect on early stages. And we can apply the same idea to the whole frame, designing and placing everything to work together with the lines of action in mind. Character, background elements, smaller details create a visual lead along the action line. They support and emphasize it, which makes super clear for the viewer to see it from one glance. For games though, in most cases, we don't have all the control of the surroundings for the effect. But we usually have at least a character who is in sync with the effect, so we can work with that. In this healing spell, instructors Ryan Rozanki and David Shavlin found a really nice way to support the character's action line with the effects. In the anticipation, the character is squashed. We can represent her pose with a curve through her leg and spine, and other parts of the body and props support it. Everything leads the viewer to look toward the hand with the spell. And in effects, the same idea is applied. The elements are curving and moving inside the spell orb. They continue the idea that was made in the character pose. On the next part, the character is stretched. The line of action goes strongly up, which in contrast with the previous squashed pose creates an exciting change. And again, effects are emphasizing the same idea. The general movement is upwards, supporting the line of action. And to bring more variety and connection to the previous stage of effect, we have some curves too. They still are following the main movement upwards, and they bring a complementary flavor to it. And we can play with these complementary movements to add more variety in the effects, to make the movement more exciting. In this netherpoof effect, made by Alex Redfish, we can see that the main action is going outwards. The initial poof expands the volume, and the negative shapes in the beginning are also following this strong outwards movement. But a few frames later, the outwards motion gradually changes with an additional curved motion. This motion is still complementing the main action, but it adds variety to the animation, and creates a more interesting experience for the viewer. I find it really helpful to think and even mark with arrows this kind of flow lines and forces while animating. Dividing them on the main force line like expansion, and then finding a way to dissolve the shape in a complementary way that would bring in more variety. It helps a lot to stay on track with what you are doing. And another self-check helping technique I really like is looking on the whole animation through the onion skin. It works great for the stationary flip books like this. This way you can see the overall composition of your animation in one image. It helps to perceive what volume you are showing with the dissolves and how spacing works throughout the sequence. I also find it just fun to look at this way. It reminds me of this kind of curved sandstone layers in perspective or clouds in the sky. Nature is a great helper with the inspiration for effects too. Now let's talk about the next principles, rhythm and contrast. They help to define and add an additional punch to the points of interest while having a cohesive picture overall. These two artworks show a very nice use of patterns to fill the frame, and then break those patterns around the focal point, bringing the most attention to the main subject. This one has a pattern of buildings in the background, which then changes to the pattern of the night sky, and then again being contrasted with the bright big shape of the moon. We also see that the background uses a pattern of straight lines and blocky shapes, and it is being contrasted with the curved lines of the character and the circular shape of the moon, which helps to separate the background from the character and bring the most attention to the main subject in a bigger picture. This illustration, made by Oritur, uses patterns as its core idea, and we are still not lost in it. The patterns break around the focal point, leading the viewer to look at it. So we can simplify it to one formula. We show a pattern, we break it, and by doing so, we create a strong contrast and a point of interest that strongly attracts the viewer's attention. And of course, we use it in effects too. Let's look at some examples. Starting with the wind avatar effect, animated by our instructor Matthew Petit. The main point of interest here is a character, and it is always supported by the shapes around it. They are rhythmically pointing to them. During this animation, even though the movement goes outwards, the attention is still drawn inside the center of the frame. It then changes for a little while to cover the whole screen, which creates a pretty exciting moment of this sequence. And to make it even more interesting, there are soft and pointy shapes which switch from one to another during this animation. The shape language changes to support faster and slower movements of the dust clouds, creating not only visually interesting contrast, but also the contrast of timing and spacing. And we can look at the contrast of timing and spacing from the perspective of big, medium, and small balance idea we talked about earlier. In this example, a medium amount of action happens in a medium amount of time. Then a fast action happens in a short amount of time. And in the end, we have a slow action during a long period of time. Pretty similar correlation as in volumes of shapes we had. And it gives not only an interesting variety of timing, but also makes a great accent on the main action of card appearing. A short and fast action is placed against a slow and long action, which creates the biggest contrast in the sequence. And we can apply the same idea to the color and value distribution. Let's talk about the value first. While working with value alone, it is already possible to determine where we want the viewer's attention the most. For example, placing the most light values against the most dark values creates the biggest amount of contrast possible. And we want to save this amount of contrast to be used around the main point of interest. In this concept, we see it around the hit point of the lightning, the place where it actually strikes the ground and is the most important for the player to perceive very fast and clear. I like sometimes to nail down the values first before doing the color pass on the concept. It is a great way to keep track of things one at a time. But it is also important to check the values during the process of working with colors too. And we can do it in a few ways. The first one, which I use the most, is through the Photoshop Grayscale preview. You can switch back and forth with a shortcut, and even continue to draw with color in this preview mode, which is awesome. You can see the settings for this on the slide. Another way is to set up your whole screen to switch to black and white with the shortcut. You can do it through the Windows settings. It is pretty nice that it works outside of the specific program, so it's possible to quick check the values while working in Engine 2. But it is important to mention that the Windows Grayscale view is in exaggerated levels of black and white, which makes sense because it is an accessibility feature which pushes the values for an easier perception. So just keep that in mind if you use it for checking your values. You can always check the contrast of your values in a more traditional old way too, by squinting your eyes to the point when you can see everything blurred, and it will give you a perception of what it will look like at a first glance or in a smaller scale. You can try it right now, by the way, and try to notice the difference between these two grayscale variants. Anyways, let's talk colors now. You probably noticed the pattern here already, but yeah, we can think about the color in terms of big, medium, and small correlations too. To balance the color distribution compositionally, we can look at each color choice as around 60% of the main color, which will fill up the volume of the effect, around 30% of the secondary color, which will add details to the set main volume, and around 10% for the accent color, which will bring more contrast. Here, for example, red-orange gradients are used to fill the space, black for variety in it, and yellow to bring an additional fine touch, pushing the contrast around the focal point. This proportion, of course, will change from one case to another. You might have more or less colors in your palette. You can play with the percentages of the color distribution too. But the main idea will stay the same, and it is to think about what you want to be the main color or value of the effect, and how you can use the accent for it to push the contrast around your focal point. And to make it easier and quicker to iterate on colors, you can use gradient maps. They reassign the colors depending on the values you have on the applied area. These are the color concept iterations made by David Shavlin, all done using gradient maps with minimal additional color layers on top for some of them. The starting point was the concept on the left, and in less than 20 minutes he got 4 new variants of color schemes for this effect. Gradient maps are a very powerful tool for fast and efficient iterations. You can try out not only subtle changes to the hues or values, but also find a completely different feel for the effect. See how you can change the distribution of colors and how it affects the look to find the one that will suit your main goal for the effect the best. And you probably noticed that I've mentioned the main goal, main idea, focal point, etc. very frequently, because we use all of the principles we talked about to achieve and exaggerate a very clear focal point. We use balance to set it in a big picture. We think about clear motion to guide the viewer's attention. We work with rhythm and contrast in shapes to exaggerate it. We push the contrast in timing around it, and use color and value with the focal point in mind. It all works together and helps us to set up perfectly clear where the viewer should look at. And it might be a lot to think about. So you can ask yourself questions to navigate your thought process. When you start working on your effect, the first thing you need to establish is where do you plan your focal point to be, and how you can lead to it in a bigger picture. So you can ask yourself, what is the most important in each stage of the effect? Which line of action could represent it the best? Do you have other variables except the effect that you need to take into consideration? So what is my context? You might need to exaggerate and complement it, so how can I balance the shape around it? And when polishing the effect, it's worth to recheck again. What is the most important stage of the effect, and does it feel like it? What is the most important in every stage of the effect, and does it read like this? Can I push it more with the contrast of timing and spacing? Can I exaggerate it more with color and values, etc.? And if we would sum it up and switch the perspective a little, what I am as a viewer notice the most? And is it actually what I wanted the viewer to look at this moment? If not, try to change some stuff to make it work. And that's it. Thank you for the attention. I hope you have found something useful in this video, or at least had some fun. Bye!
I hope you found that helpful on your VFX learning journey. For more information and free courses like this one, go ahead and check out vfxapprentice.com. You can come over there and see all the cool stuff that we've got set up. We have a Discord server and free training, also tons of lessons inside of our courses for both 2D and 3D effects, for animation and real-time effects as well. And there's just lots of great things. You can see why thousands of people have been joining us to accelerate their learning journeys, whether they're total beginners or even working professionals. All right, that's everything for now, and we'll catch you in the next video.